So you want to be up there then? Yes. How do you want to handle it? Because you're just going to be sitting here quiet for a while. Are you okay with that?
Oh, yeah.
Like I'm thinking if you were sitting here and then I invite you. I mean, I'm just thinking it's awkward for you to just be
Right, that's
sitting there like,
yes. Plus you, yeah.
But so you'll introduce us
Yeah,
and then just explain that I'm going to invite Gabriel up.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm gonna read this little. I'll read this first. And we can begin. I think the YouTube situation is already set up and taken care of on its own. So, okay. Read the opening remarks. Welcome to Queerness and Catholic Imagery with author Vince Scombati. Did I say that right? I did say that. Okay. And artist Gabriel Garcia Roman, who's seated, but who you will meet. And welcome to the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. My name is Bella Florence, and I'm a volunteer here at the Bureau. I'm joined by volunteer Drew Pizarra. Yes. The Bureau is a government agency for a government that does not exist yet. And the primary service that we provide is holding this. I just got these lines, which is why I'm looking at. Is holding this space for queer culture. The Bureau is an all-volunteer staff, independent queer bookstore and cultural center, open Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m. The Bureau relies on sales and donations to support our work, and we have a suggested donation of $10 for tonight's event. I will pass around a bag with change, but you can also make a donation through Venmo if you would like at BGSQD. Please make a donation if you're able to do so, but if money is tight and you plan on buying books, please hold on to your money and buy books. So I'm going to pass the bag. Well, you don't have to make a donation, but pass it to somebody behind you. If you are not already on our email list, you can sign up for that at the back of the room over there, and you will receive an email every other Monday about our many upcoming events. The Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We are actively seeking to partner with and provide material support to a local queer Indigenous organization. We hope to make an announcement about this partnership in the near future, but in the meantime, we encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community House's Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-Native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. You can find out more at manahatafund.org. Vince Gambotti's debut novel, Most Precious Blood, received an Ippy Award, a Kirkus Star Review, was a Forward Indies finalist in literary fiction, a Central New York Book Awards finalist, and was listed as recommended reading by the Working Class Studies Association. His short story collection, Undertow of Memory, includes stories awarded by the Catherine Ann Porter Prize for Fiction and the Saints and Sinners Fiction Contest. His fiction and creative nonfiction have appeared in the anthology Queer and Catholic, North American Review, Nimrod International Journal, Voices in Italian Americana, Saints and Sinners, New Fiction from the Festival, Off the Rocks, the Journal of GLBT Family Studies, and Lavender Magazine, where he wrote a queer parenting column. Sanctuaries is Vince's second novel. Gabriel Garcia Roman, who is seated in the front row and who you will meet momentarily, is a multidisciplinary artist and craftsman who examines and decodes the politics of identity through intricate and process-based work. His art has been acquired by the International Center of Photography and has been shown at the Museum of Latin American Art in Long Beach, California, Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York, the Center for Photography at Woodstock, and numerous other institutions and galleries. He was a 2018 recipient of the National Association of Latino Art and Culture's Artist Grant, and in 2019 was commissioned by the Leslie Lohman Museum to bring his Queer Icons series into the streets for the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, where 100 Queer Icons flags were marched down the World Pride Route. In 2022, he was one of 7 artists whose work was featured in collaboration with Target's Mass K campaign for Latinx Heritage Month. And now the event can begin. You're welcome.
First, you're hearing me okay here with the microphone and all that? Okay. First,
A little more, little closer. The old people.
is that better?
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. First, thank you. Thank you for coming. And I want to give a special thanks to Greg and Donnie, the co-founders of the Bureau, which again is this bookstore and a venue for queer artists to either show their work or to read and speak. I mean, especially in a time right now, it's clear we're under attack. People are trying to erase us, trying to erase our history, trying to erase us as a people. So any work that someone does to make sure that our voices in our lives still out there is commendable. They are at the Triangle Awards dinner tonight. They couldn't be there. And because they're receiving an award for what they do, a well-deserved award. So thank you to them. Thank you to you for being here. So what is this going to look like? I mean, Gabriel and I met last year. Gabriel's work was exhibited at a gallery in Syracuse called Art Rage. And I was on the board of that gallery, and Gabriel ended our season there. And we became friends. And then he came up again during the summer, and we spoke at Pride Day at the New York State Fair. And then when I knew that I was going to be doing reading here, I spoke with Gabriel about some kind of a collaboration. And though our work speaks to many issues, one of the issues that our work has in common is this whole idea of Catholic imagery and how it impacts our work. So again, our work goes beyond that, but that is something that connects both of us. So we thought that that might be a good venue, a good way for us to do our readings. And then in a little while, Gabriel will show his images from his brilliant, no exaggeration, Queer Icons exhibit. So we might ask the question, why would 2 queer men have an institution that is so bent on erasing who we are, be such a part of our work. You know, like what is that all about? You know, we could be here for days talking about that, but in short, I guess I would say, part it's almost like coming from an abusive family. We still talk about the family. We still work through our trauma. And in my case, in my particular case, Gabriel will talk more about the imagery. There was story that I fell in love with. There was story that I found fascinating. There was story of the margins. But unfortunately, what I found out eventually was that I was part of a margin that was not accepted. It was not the margin to be included. You know, so even though we might have heard stories about, you know, John being the special friend, and John, behold your mother, and Mary, behold your son, from a single man at that time, all of anything around that was erased. Any story of anything else that doesn't fit with what is now a status quo in our society, heterosexist, I would argue, status quo in our society, is going to be placed out in the margins. So artists, I mean, what do artists do? Part of what we do is constantly try to work through our trauma. We tell the same stories over and over again in certain ways. I'm not saying that's all artists do, but it's part of what we do. Part of what we do is constantly trying to figure out what is it that still attracts us to something? What are we trying to work through? So the section that I'm going to read from my book, Sanctuaries, my current novel, will address some of what I'm talking about. We'll address Catholic imagery. And I'm not alone in doing this. We could look at one of the most iconic books ever written as far as queer literature goes. And that's Dancer from the Dance, Andrew Holleran's Dancer from the Dance, which I'm sure is here on the shelf. And when we look at his book, it's replete with Catholic imagery. I mean, we could pick one line. The people on downs were hardly able to move, and the others rising from the couches where they had been sprawled like martyrs, who had given up their souls to Christ, pushed into the floor, and united in the cries of joy. I mean, you'll find these kinds of sentences over and over and over again in his work. And in his most recent book, Andrew is now, this was 1978. Andrew is now 79 years old. His most recent book, The Kingdom of Sand, is the same thing. You're still going to find that after all of these years, he's still bringing this kind of language into his work. And it's no accident that the most popular, I would argue, I mean, unless maybe somebody has another suggestion, but the most popular queer literary festival in this country, in New Orleans, that happens every year is called Saints and Sinners. You know, again, constantly bringing those ideas into our artist's work. What is it that we're grappling with? So having said that, I've picked a section of Sanctuaries to read to you a little, well, let's set the stage for the time first, and if you want to bring up those. The timing of Sanctuaries winds up being, most of it is like late 60s, early 70s. So this is during the time of Stonewall.
One second.
Okay. Which was more than 3 birds sitting on a bench. Okay. This happened during the time of Stonewall. I'm sure everybody here is familiar with Stonewall. But there's something that I want to point out. I think Stonewall has always received the short end of the stick as far as being one of the most important revolts that ever happened in this country. And I think if we look at the right, we could understand why we want to make that invisible. But even if we look at the mainstream left, and what I mean by the mainstream left, I would say the cisgender straight left, Stonewall has kind of been compartmentalized into something, well, that's something that was wonderful that gay people did. But it was much more than that. Stonewall was a revolt of enough is enough around many issues. It wasn't just about who people sleep with or how people dress. It had to do with class. It had to do with race. It had to do with police brutality. It had to do with the relationship between the police and the mafia. It was definitely a case of intersectionality, where people who had had enough on many, many issues finally said no more. Many of the people who frequented Stonewall were not able to get into other gay bars. So this is something that we have to remember about Stonewall. It was much, much larger than just about, again, who somebody sleeps with or how somebody dressed. However, somebody was marginalized. If somebody was Black, but they were marginalized in their community because of their sexual orientation, or if somebody was gay, but they were marginalized by that community because they were Black, or if somebody was poor and marginalized from the queer community in general because they were too poor or too run down. So it's really a case of a revolt of intersectionality where we have had it up to here. Enough is enough. And I don't think Stonewall was ever given that kind of recognition. So this is the time period that takes place in. You know, if we could switch to the next. And I also want to, I have some images of the Christopher Street piers, because that's also part of the setting of what we're going to talk about. When we look around Manhattan Island now, we see these parks, we see the Island, we see all of these things that more resemble Disneyland to me than the New York City that I knew. But this is what was left, and this is where folk went to not only find love and affection and sex and lust, but also to find community and culture. There was a lot of artwork, a lot of culture that came out of this time. But it was, I don't want to paint it as some kind of romanticized memory. It was dangerous. It was gritty. New York City in the late 60s and early 70s was very different than the New York City we got now. So I'm just trying to, this is the time period that we're going to be talking about. So in our story Sanctuaries, our protagonist is then Gianni. And he's a young queer man coming out at the time, still mostly classic. And he has, at this point in the novel, I mean, it's a lot of things that happen early on, but at this point in the novel, his friend Ezra works for the Village Voice. And there is this article about Stonewall. And he hears about Stonewall. He didn't know anything about it. And the next night or the week after, he ventures down to Christopher Street, a place he never heard of. And he goes into a bar called Keller's. Keller's no longer exists, but it was a bar on West Street at the time. And at that time it was a bar, it went through many iterations, but at that time it was predominantly a Black leather bar. And he stumbles into this bar. For the first time he was in a gay bar. First time he was on Christopher Street. And he follows some people into the bar. And he meets this character, Gabriel. No relation to the Gabriel that I know. I met Gabriel after this whole book was written, but I love his name is Gabriel. But so he meets this character, Gabriel. And then he comes across Gabriel again at a movie theater that he works at. And he pretends at first that he doesn't know Gabriel because he's embarrassed. Because Gabriel is much more flamboyant in his appearance. Gabriel is a drag queen. I know he's not always in total drag. There's always there's either paint on his fingernails, there's glitter on his eyes. There's something that's showing that he's at the time what we would refer to as gender fucking, where he's playing with both genders. So this is what Gabriel did. And Gianni was a little bit uncomfortable. So he pretended at first he didn't know him, but finally said hello to him. So now when we meet Gabriel again, what we're seeing is this is a year afterwards. Gianni has just received news that a friend of his has passed away, and he went to visit the friend's parents. And in his grieving, he, rather than going home, he heads to the village, at first thinking he's going to head to the piers. Squinting through his tears, he drove from Island Park to Manhattan instead of home to Queens. After parking his van on a narrow street in Greenwich Village, he headed to the piers in search of sex. The rush of the hunt might clear his head and numb his emotions, if only for an hour or two. About to cross West Street and head under the highway, he first glanced left and spotted folks outside of Keller's, too far away to make out features. A year passed since he last saw Gabriel at the Orchard. Some nights he hit the bars along Christopher and West Streets, or cruised the piers, but he stayed away from Keller's for fear of running into Gabriel. For Gianni, the village was a world of strangers and one-nighters, not friendships. Maybe it's time to change that, he thought. He crossed Christopher Street. He walked along west toward Barrow. Two people were leaving Keller's. Gianni recognized Tammy from the Lena Horne Festival. Excuse me. Tammy paused and looked at Gianni. Is Gabriel here? Who wants to know? I'm Gianni. Remember, we met at the Orchard. Remember the Lena Horne Festival? Oh yes, I remember. You were sorry for not saying hello. Tammy and her friend resumed walking. Tammy waved her hand toward Keller's as if dismissing Gianni. Shooting pool, she said. There were a few people in the bar, and Gianni spotted Gabriel leaning over a pool table about to take a shot. Gabriel? Gabriel turned, Gianni's eyes widened and jaw dropped. Don't look so frightened, child. Gabriel set down the cue stick and fanned his long orange fingernails against his swollen, plum-colored eyes. I wore full drag a few nights ago. Absolutely stunning. Some straight boys just messed with the wrong queen. You know, you should see what they look like. Gabriel's friends eyed Gianni and offered a chorus of, Girls, don't get your panties in a sweat. This here's my prodigal son come home to beg his mother's forgiveness after a very long absence. Johnny shrugged his shoulders. You're right. Well, I have had enough, 8-Ball. How about you buy me a cup of Java? Gabriel waved goodbye to his friends, grabbed his white fur jacket, and slipped his arm through Gianni's. Given it was a Tuesday and early evening, Christopher Street felt like Coney Island off season. Child, you look troubled. Although you always look troubled, part of your charm. Kind of like, what's his name in that movie from Rebels? Rebels Without a Cause? That's it. You look like the dark-haired actor, Sal Mineo. I seem to look, child, no wonder you work in a theater. I seem to look like everyone. Not everyone, child. Only good-looking, brooding guys. Johnny laughed at that. A man wearing a red bandana and a leather jacket stepped into the street. In the storefront window behind him stood two mannequins dressed in full leather, from cap to boots. And behind the mannequins was a pegboard festooned with chains and dildos. The man smirked at Gabriel and Gianni. Someone's having chicken for dinner. Gabriel flipped him the bird and pulled Gianni close. Don't mind that old chicken hawk. They turned the corner, walked a few blocks, and entered Tiffany's Diner, an abundance of pink mica, pink vinyl boots, pink frosted glass, suggested a flamboyance of flamingos descending upon Sheridan Square. Johnny took off his coat. Don't you look dapper? Gabriel removed his jacket. In Gianni's neighborhood, a long-haired, white 20-year-old, barely a man, wearing a white button-down shirt and tie, given his visit to the Silvermans, would draw a lot of attention sitting across from a muscular 40-ish black man with a shiner who wore a t-shirt with the Marilyn Monroe quote, "Give a girl the right shoes and she can conquer the world." At Tiffany's, there were simply 2 more customers. Over bacon and eggs, home fries, toast, and several cups of coffee, Johnny told Gabriel about his visiting Maura's parents. Gabriel's animated response, shaking his head and punctuating his words with terrible mercy, prompted Gianni to go on. By the time the waitress cleared their plates, he spilled details about first meeting Maura and Owen, not being able to erase Owen from his thoughts. "You got it bad, but first love can be like that." Gabriel sighed. "It's like imprinting, child. When baby ducks first see their mama, all they can think of is mama. She moves, they move. She jumps in a pond, they jump in a pond. If she jumped off a roof, they'd follow her. Sounds like you got a serious case of imprinting." Gabriel brushed his empty cup to the edge of the pink Formica table for the waitress to fill. "You want more, child?" "No, thanks. This is going to sound weird, but I don't think it was an accident that Hans ran into Saul and mentioned to Rafaela and me that Saul was moving to Island Park. It's like Maura wanted me to know what happened to her. Kind of her way of saying goodbye, but more than that. You know the way I'm stuck on Owen? I think Owen is stuck on Maura. And Maura wants me to let him know she's gone so he can move on with his life. Like I'm supposed to be a messenger. Could be. Gabriel added milk and 3 packets of sugar to his coffee. Sometimes you're asked to do the work of angels. Johnny looked at Gabriel. Angels, are you religious? My daddy was a preacher. So let's say I got religion. Too much religion. The only thing I liked about church was the choir director's package. Talk about amazing grace. Gabriel arched his broad shoulders back, turned his face to the right, and his fingers fluffed his scarf. The harsh restaurant lighting accentuated Gabriel's bruised eye and cheek. I wasn't always this ebony goddess. I was once an ashy little sissy who had the Holy Ghost beat into him and then right out of him. Johnny recalled Rafaela lighting candles in church. He recalled his own reflection in the bakery window while he watched the moving van drive away. He looked at Gabriel and saw in him what he recognized in Rafaela, what he now understood others recognized in him. He saw beyond Gabriel's bruised eye and cheek, beyond his taut ebony muscles, beyond his drab. He saw Gabriel's trauma. I'm sorry, Gianni said. Child, that was a long time ago. Johnny assumed this wasn't the first shiner Gabriel had. He figured Gabriel had a lot of them before he learned how to defend himself and gave as good as he got, even better. No, Gianni said, I'm sorry for not saying hello to you right away when you came to the orchard. You already apologized for that. But I'm apologizing again. I know what it feels like to be invisible, to feel like you're not seen, to feel like you're not even real. I was very wrong to not say hello to you as soon as I saw you. Very, very wrong. I'm truly sorry. Thank you, child. You're sweet. Johnny picked up the check, my treat. I ain't gonna argue. The cashier handed Gabriel a shopping bag. She snapped her gum and rattled off a list of sandwiches. You got some ham and cheese in there, you got some pastrami, you got some corned beef. Thanks, Sylvia. Tell Danny he's a doll. Shopping bag in one hand, Gabriel took Gianni's arm with his other hand, and they headed to the riverfront. Hey, Gabriel. A light-skinned boy with hair and cornrows gone nappy appeared out of the dark alley that smelled like piss. You hungry, child? Sure. Gabriel held out the open bag. Close your coat, child, it's November. The boy flashed a smile that could melt a glacier. John's got to see the merchandise. Gabriel shook his head. Careful your merchandise don't freeze and break off. The boy laughed and bit into his sandwich. Thanks, you're the best, Gabriel. By the time Gianni and Gabriel reached the piers, one sandwich after another had been claimed by hungry teenagers, some barely 13 years old. Gabriel tossed the empty bag and lit a cigarette. Gianni considered what Gabriel had said about imprinting. Gabriel was a mama hen, and this brood of young queer boys with Sister Joan Marie might have once called wretched souls were his baby chicks. And Gabriel didn't call them sinners, didn't tell them to repent, didn't have any agenda except to feed them because they were hungry. You always do this, Gianni said. Do what? Give out free food? Not just me, these children has to eat. Restaurants throw out more food than they can sell. I just collect it before it hits the dumpsters. Are they hustling? I might have seen a couple of these guys around before. Hustling, selling weed. Some pick up a few bucks with little jobs here and there, washing toilets or sweeping up after the bar's closed. What they got in common is being queer, and their families threw them out. Johnny wondered what his parents would say or do if he came out to them. Where do they sleep? Gabriel swept his hand across the view of the riverfront, boarded up warehouses and empty parked trucks. The Ritz, Gabriel said. And for a couple of bucks, some bars also let the children sleep in back rooms. The Stonewall used to do that before it closed. There's also a place in the East Village a couple of sister friends started. Some kids say they're on and off. I used to keep a couple of mattresses on the floor where I live, but then one or two kids ripped off Gunter's stuff. I get it. You do what you got to do when you don't know what's coming next. But Gunter was getting old. Better not to have kids coming and going, especially if I wasn't there. Johnny didn't ask who Gunter was. He figured Gabriel would tell him if he wanted him to know. A full moon appeared, vanished behind the clouds, then reappeared like a child playing peekaboo. Johnny preferred when it hit. Gabriel's bruised eye and cheek were less visible. Earlier you said sometimes people do the work of angels, people like you. I mean, you know, giving out food and all. I'm no angel, Gabriel said. Johnny laughed. That's a Mae West movie. Mae West? I know a drag queen who does a better Mae West than Mae West. Where do you think she got her material? Black drag child. Only difference is she got the big bucks. What else is new? Gabriel's banter turned serious. I've been where these children are and survived, at least so far. Not everyone does. Gabriel pointed to the Hudson. That river eats a lot of queer kids, especially queer Black kids. Sometimes nobody else wants them except the river. And sometimes they don't go willingly. Moonlight reflected on the rippling Hudson. Gabriel stamped out a cigarette. I'm heading back to Keller's. What's your poison? Gabriel held out both his hands, palms open like the statues of Madonnas in Gate of Heaven. He held one hand toward the piers and one toward Keller's. I'll probably head home. Thanks for listening to me. You know, the whole thing about Laura and Owen. Anytime, child, anytime. That's what mothers are for. Gabriel flooded his fingers goodbye and walked toward Keller's. Again, passing clouds obscured the moonlight. Leaving the Hudson to churn without sparkle. Johnny walked out to the end of the pier. He ignored the surrounding shadows. He sat on a pile that rose slightly above the pier's rotted decking and he stared at the water. How much pain must someone feel to find these pitiless waters seductive? He saw hands reach up, slap at the river's current, grab at the cold night air. He pressed his palms against his cheeks and wiped tears away. This had been a day for grieving, for Maura, for the boys whose parents had thrown them out like pottery that didn't blaze the way the potter expected. Johnny stood. Before he turned away from the river, he made the sign of the cross, something he hadn't done for some time. He thought of the parable of the loaves and the fishes, but he saw it differently. It was about the lie of scarcity. Few have much and so many have little. Dumps behind American restaurants devour enough loaves and fishes to feed the multitudes. That's really fucked up. Johnny called at the river. Amen, someone responded from the shadows. Johnny laughed. He left the pier, walked onto the highway, crossed West Street and up Christopher Street. He ignored the guys passing him. And he thought about times he was with someone he just met, would probably never meet again, and then ride the subway to St. Patrick's Cathedral. He'd sit among hundreds of lit vigil candles, not to beg forgiveness for marble statues, but to think and make sense of it all. Making sense of nonsense was his prayer. So much he had to let go of. Was there anything left to cling to? Walking to the garage, he recalled a Tonight Show where the guest jokingly called herself a recovering Catholic. Exactly, he thought. Yep, that's what I am. I'm a recovering Catholic. Driving home, Gianni, the recovering Catholic, remembered the day at Figaro's when Ezra handed him a copy of the Village Voice. The forces of faggotry is how the Voice described the Stonewall Rebellion. Back then, Gianni hated that sentence, but now he smiled at the memory of it. It reminded him of Gabriel. Gabriel definitely made faggotry a force. Johnny pictured Gabriel handing out sandwiches, which could just as well be loaves and fishes. Gabriel called each kid child. And when he came upon someone Gabriel didn't know, he introduced himself. And then he asked if they were hungry. That's all Gabriel said. Are you hungry? Nothing transactional. No quid pro quo. No demand for repentance. Just, are you hungry? And if the kids said yes, he gave them a sandwich. Whew. I didn't expect to get so emotional, but you know, I'm a simpy kind of guy. You know, I just do that kind of shit. So anyway, before I kind of as a segue from what I did to inviting Gabriel up. I want to read. We have a picture here of a friend of mine. Emmanuel Xavier Berger, who Manny would have been here tonight, but he's hosting the dinner tonight at the where Greg and Daniel are getting the triangle. So he's not able to be here, but Gabriel was kind enough to bring a photograph. Emmanuel is one of Gabriel's queer icons, and Manny grew up on these piers. He's younger than me. He's don't know, tell what his age is. I don't know but he's younger than I am. But he grew up a little after this time. But he grew up on the piers. He was thrown out of his house because of being queer. And it did have to do with religion. And he grew up the hard way. And he grew up with, even though they're so villainized now, he grew up with drag queens who mothered him. Now, I can't speak today, even Gabriel now, I don't know how Gabriel would identify. I don't know if Gabriel would still identify as a drag queen. I don't know if Gabriel would identify as genderqueer. I don't know. But at that time, these people acted as surrogate parents to the children that nobody wanted. And they saved a lot of them. They saved a lot of them. Manny being one of them. And now he's on the board of the Triangle Awards, hosting a dinner. So anyway, he's one of my favorite spoken word artists. Unfortunately, I thought his book here, but his poetry book would be here, but they sold out. So I wanted to read his whole poem, if Jesus Were Gay. We don't have it. So I'm going to read part of it and then invite Gabriel up. If Jesus were gay, would you tattoo him to your body, hang him from your chest, pray to him and worship the Son of Man? Would you praise him after dying for your sins? If it was revealed Jesus kissed another man, but not on the cheek, would you still beg him forgiveness, ask him for miracles, hope your loved ones get to meet him in heaven? Yeah, I promise not to cry during this, so I'll try not to.
Hi, everybody. I'm not sure how you want to do this, if you want to.
Yeah, well, I mean, Gabriel is going to share a bunch of his images from his Queer Icons exhibit. And again, this is just a carryover from before. This isn't good, but it's carryover from before of the piers and what it looks like at the time. And as you can see, there was some remarkable art that came out of that time. Remarkable art. But so I've seen Gabriel's exhibit. I've heard him speak. And one of the things the first question that I want to pose, of course, has to do with this umbrella we're talking about, with Catholic imagery. And I came from the place of story. I'm a writer, so story. Gabriel came from a very different place, where there were the imageries that impressed him. So maybe if you could first speak to that, Gabriel, the way you were swept up with the imagery that you saw in the church.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, well, first of all, thanks everybody for being here, and thank you, Vince, for inviting me. I'm a total introvert, so this is really hard for me, but here I am. So how I got introduced to art, and what I always like to say is that I grew up Catholic, and religious art was my introduction to art. You know, walking into a church, cathedrals, I was always drawn to like the strong imagery that you see of like saints. They were always so full of pride and always with an amazing halo. Also, I'm Mexican, and in most Latin American countries, Catholicism is so embedded in our culture that even if we're not practicing Catholics, we sort of identify as Catholics just because it's just everywhere, you know. Even within our language, even our cultural icons or imagery, like, so one of the things that I also or talk about is that I didn't get introduced to art until much later in life. I was in my 20s when I moved to New York City, and when I started making art. Prior to that, I was really surviving, you know, as a queer person, and art is really what allowed me to start living and living outside of myself. So one of the first things that I started doing or gravitated towards was myself. I started doing self-portraits. So I wanted to share one of the first pieces that I made when I started. So this is me as Juan Diego, who's now, since this photograph has been taken, has been canonized and is now considered a saint. But Juan Diego was the person who discovered, or who the Virgin Mary, the Virgen de Guadalupe, appeared to. And he was this indigenous person who was, I guess, who was converted, into Catholicism. And the story goes that the Virgen de Guadalupe appeared to him, and he went to the priest and was like, I just saw the Virgin Mary, and they asked for proof. So when he went to this very arid area where she had appeared, there was like a bush of roses. And so and when he carried the bush of roses and he showed, her image appeared onto his jarape, which is what I'm wearing. So this is what that image is. And also one of the first pieces that I also worked on was me replicating the Virgen de Guadalupe using photographs that I had taken in my first trip to LA. And I started photographing a lot of the murals and incorporated this collage. So I wanted to share those two first because it's sort of like a springboard into my long-term project, which is called Queer Icons. So Queer Icons is a portrait series that I started a little over 10 years ago. And it's a portrait series that I started to highlight queer folks of color, because it was during a time when there was a lot of queer imagery and queer culture was becoming a little more, I guess, almost even part of pop culture. There was all these television shows where queer characters were being introduced. But even with all of that advancement with marriage equality, I was still not seeing queer folks of color being represented. So I wanted to do something to highlight my community. So that's when I started Queer Icons. And so, as I mentioned, I was always drawn to the halo. And for me, the halo was a badge of honor. It was like a human being who goes above and beyond their call of duty as a person for the betterment of their community. So they do an act, and then they get their halo. So this is sort of what I was doing. And so one of the things that I talk to when I'm taking these portraits is I also want to highlight this community that's disenfranchised, right? But I want them to always look directly at the camera and defiantly, basically saying, like, you tried to snuff us out, but we're still here, we're still thriving. Here's some more images.
You speak to, I mean, I knew this already. I knew this from us having conversations and from your other exhibit that you wanted to, in particular, highlight queer folks of color. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little more to that, and not only just to that, but to some of the individual people that you selected. I remember you had some wonderful stories about a few of the folks.
Right. Yeah. So when I started this project, and when I was showing the work, folks had a lot of questions. They were asking, like, well, who are these people? And it started getting the project started getting a little bigger than, not that what I wanted, but it started getting sort of I became a little more preoccupied with the image over the content. And that's around that same time I met Mitchell, whose portrait is here on the screen. And this is somebody, so at this point, I'm photographing folks that are not people that I know. These are friends of friends. So there was really no connection. So we had to establish a connection first before they felt comfortable taking their portrait. So we started, when they came over, we were just having a regular conversation, and then they backed out at the last minute saying it was a little too much pressure to be photographed. And so we were just trying to, I was trying to like put them at ease. And so, we smoked a little bit and drank a little bit. And then the conversation started flowing. And one of the things that really drew me to him was his life story, which is, as a teenager, he ran away from home because just because it wasn't a safe environment. So he moved to New York City as a teenager, and as a teenager with not many means, he started using his body as a way to make a living. Very similar to Manny and a lot of what your book talks about. So he had shared this story of how he had a friend who was murdered by his John, and because his friend was a sex worker and a person of color and a young person, nothing was being done to find this person's killer. And Mitchell, who as a teenager decided that he wasn't going to stay quiet, and any chance that he got to go to any kind of press conference where there was a politician speaking, he would interrupt those spaces to share his friend's story. And when he shared that story with me, I was completely blown away, because I'm like, that's a lot of courage for a teenager to have. And also, he took it upon himself to do that. And that's when I started realizing, like, this project needs to be highlighting folks who are actually doing work for the community. They should be, I should be focusing on community activists, organizers. I even think artists are activists in a way, because it's their stories or their images that open up conversations. So Mitchell is definitely like the inspiration for where this body of work has evolved, basically. And here's some other images. And over the years, I started incorporating, I have a video of how this process is made towards the end, but I could share a little bit of, this is a printmaking process. So it's a photogravure, and all the color you see is actually decorative paper that I've collaged. So it's not a painting, and it starts as a photograph, but it's a print, or it's in the etching. But then I started adding elements like the sequence around the halo, just to, again, because it's an ongoing project, I'm always trying to add more elements or work through the images.
I don't know if it shows well, not so much in this picture, and I don't know if you have any images on there, but one of the things I remember when I saw your exhibit with the frames,
Mm-hmm.
So I guess there's two things I'd like you to speak to a little bit. One is okay, that's, he makes these beautiful, beautiful frames, which were a pain in the ass to pack and unpack. And we were unloading them at Art Rage and being afraid to break anything, but they are beautiful. But so the intricacy of the frames, if you could speak to that a little bit, and also the writing.
Yeah,
the writing that's in the background.
yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if you noticed, there were some images that didn't have text and some images that do have text. So all the images with no text are earlier work where I guess it was the first 2 years that I started working on this, where it was just her portrait. Then, as I mentioned, when I started showing you this work, a lot of people had questions, and then I started thinking that already as a community that's disenfranchised, that's often silenced, erased, in a way I was doing something similar where I'm taking their image and put it in a frame and hanging it up on a wall. And I felt like I'm just as guilty as the broader society by doing the same thing. So I started thinking about what can I do to amplify their voices or to share their story. And that's when I thought about the idea of collaborating with the person whose portrait I've taken. And so all the writing that you see behind is actually handwritten by the person. So it's either about their identity or it could be about a story that they want to share. But it's that the text or the copy is completely up to the person whose portrait it is. And the frames, so the frames, again, because I grew up Catholic and I just love the pageantry of Catholicism, because there's so much gold and there's so much beautiful hardwood, that I also wanted to do that, but in my way, which is using these scraps of wood that I have to create these frames. So I also make furniture or work with wood. So I have tons of wood laying around. And when I started making these frames, I started, instead of buying wood, I was just using all the stuff that I had first, which ended up basically the impetus for why these frames look like the way they do. And so even with the frames, I started thinking about how, again, as queer folks, and specifically even queer folks of color, where we're often given scraps, right? And we're able to create beauty out of scraps. And so that's also the idea behind these frames. And and also what I recently started thinking about with the frames are the fact that, I could have easily just made a frame with 4 pieces of wood, but interlocking each little block onto each other, is sort of creating the idea of community, where each little block that's glued on together is creating a stronger voice, a stronger community. So that's sort of the idea also behind the frames. And this is one of the ones that was featured in Syracuse for last year's exhibit. And I started thinking a little more about, before I was making the frames and then putting a print in it, but now I'm being a little more intentional with making frames specifically for the prints that I'm working on. So, for example, like this is Hunter, a trans person in Syracuse. And so my idea behind this frame is like, I started thinking about the cactus that they drew next to them. And I started seeing these blocks of wood as like the spines of a cactus, which is obviously like used as a defense mechanism, right, for the cactus, but also thinking about trans folks and how they are the most marginalized of the communities, that to feel safe, they have to create these spikes, you know, and so I just did that, created the spikes in this frame. So I'm going to show a little video of how these prints are made. So before I started, the thing in the middle is a metal frame. It's a metal frame that has the image burned onto it, and I'm about to ink it. And the paper that you see on the side, that's all the decorative paper that I'm going to collage onto that print. And it's all held together with wheat paste. And it's all a lot of handwork, as you can see, like everything is very process based, which I really enjoy. So that's the white paper that I used to print, and then so I'm running it through the press, and the pressure of the press with the wheat paste and the water on the white paper fuses the image as one. So then I had to wait for a couple of weeks for it to be completely dry before I do the final step, which is the screen printing. So when I said that it's their handwriting, they're not literally handwriting onto the print. I've given them a copy of what the image is going to look like, and they have, by the time, I mean, while the print is drawing for those weeks, they have those weeks to write their text. And so it's literally just a Xerox copy of what the image is. And once they give it to me, I scan it and size up the text according to the print that I'm making. And so that's a little happy dance because it came out. And I just wanted to end the slideshow with one of the highlights of my career so far is the fact that 100 of my images were made into flags and were flown during World Pride 2019 for Leslie Lohman. It was pretty surreal to see my work at this scale, and it's such a stage like New York City. Also running with the theme of Catholicism, it's like a Catholic procession. I forgot those things.
Before we open it to comments and questions, because I want you guys to be part of what we're doing. Just some business before I forget. I'm all for indie bookstores, indie presses, indie artists. Yeah, you could get sanctuaries on Amazon, but it's right here at the bookstore. So, you know, these guys ordered a bunch of them. Please, you know, if you're interested, purchase it while you're here, so it benefits the Bureau. And, you know, I'll be glad to sign it, not sign it, whatever you want before we leave. Any comments, questions? Don't be shy. Say something. Ask either of us, ask both of us.
I have a question going back to your, I think it was the third from the end portrait that you had put up. And I'm Catholic. So I was fascinated with the way you constantly use the halo effect and all of that. And congratulations, that last video was amazing. And I think I saw pictures of it, so kudos to you. But what I got out of it went the four sides. To me, looking at it now, my vision is not the greatest, but it replicated to me the crown of thorns.
Right.
Is that it?
No, it wasn't, but I like that idea. I do replicate the crown of thorns in other work that I make. So,
Oh, okay.
but I didn't see it, but now I see
did,
it. Yeah.
yes, very much so. Okay.
Thank you.
Two things, I'll echo what she was saying about, I'm thinking you're photoshopping all of this and kind of blown away. It's fantastic. And I'm wondering what happened to the flags, those beautiful flags.
So because it was 100 and they were 2 of each, I kept 50 of them and the other 50 I gave to the person whose portrait it is. And some of them have donated the flags to queer organizations in California and other places.
So yeah, an exhibit would be possible then.
Yeah.
You have one coming up. Sure. Right, St. John the Divine.
Yeah. So I have an exhibit coming up May 31st, and it'll be up for a couple of months at St. John the Divine, 110th Street in Amsterdam. But it only be one of the flags. They chose the one, the one of me. It's gonna be yeah. Well, it'll just be one flag, but 12 prints framed. So you'll see the actual frames.
And aren't some of your pictures going to be here too at the center?
That's right. Also, there's a group show happening here at the center in June that I'm part of, and there's going to be 5 of those in this show also. So in June you can come in and they'll be somewhere in the work.
And you had your hand up, yes.
Yeah, so I'm really curious about like the writing process as well. So do you like remember the specific moments?
Okay, I went to see a play last night and I finally believe what my son has been telling me, that I need a hearing aid. So you're gonna have to speak up.
Okay, well, I think there's some similarities between both your work, right? They're both very process oriented. So I'm curious, do you know the moment you came up with the idea for Sanctuary? And then also from that, kind of what was your process in developing the story and how did you get to the final?
I mean, if you read Sanctuaries and if you choose to read Most Precious Blood or any of my other work, I'm very character driven. My work is very character driven. So I'm not a sci-fi writer. I'm not a mystery writer. I don't outline and know what the ending is going to be before it comes. I'm not plot driven, is I guess what I'm saying. So it's very much about having an idea of characters and story, of course, somewhat. But as I go along, I get to know the characters more. I get to know them more. I get to learn about the story. And it's almost at some point like I'm being told what's going to happen. But it's very, very anchored in the character and what they would be doing. It's almost like you could remove these characters from the story and put them in something else. And it's still about the character. But it's depending on the kind of writing you do, it's a very, very different process. Does that answer or help a little bit?
Yeah.
But I definitely don't. I'm not a writer that I don't have an outline before I start. Some writers do. You know, I don't start out with this is going to be chapter 1, chapter 2, and this is the way it's going to end. I could be as surprised as you were that it actually ended. It actually ended that way.
Any of your work autobiographical?
Okay, I think it was, no, of course his name goes out of my head, Great Gatsby, help me, Great Gatsby. Fitzgerald, right. You know, Fitzgerald, I think, was the one that says there's 2 or 3 very dramatic things that happen in an author's life. And they keep writing that story over and over again until their readers don't believe them anymore, you know, as long as they could get away with it. So I think in part, yes, writing is inspired by life experience. None of it is autobiographical. It's fiction. But is it, yeah, I'm gay. Did I grow, I mean, in sanctuaries in particular, I'm gay. Did I grow up during this time period? Yes. The protagonist in this is also an adoptee. I'm adopted. So there's a lot of ways I could connect, but it's not autobiographical.
I knew the answer to
At least I'll never tell if it is. Yes.
What are some of both your biggest inspirations in terms of writing for you or just in general? Like, what other artists and creators inspire you?
What other art, do you want to start with? I mean,
Sure.
our biggest inspirations and what artists have inspired us.
I always get stuck with that question because I'm always like, oh, should I have to come up with an artist name? But honestly, the truthful answer is my dad. Like, I see my dad as the person who taught me how to question things, look at things, to get something, break it apart, put it back together just to see how it works. He's the one who, at the time, it was horrible. I didn't like being his assistant, but thanks to him, I know how to use a power tool. I know how to use power tools. And I always credit him for me being an artist. It was his brain. I basically am him. And I feel like if he had the opportunity that I have, that he gave me, he would also be an amazing artist. Not that I'm just called myself an amazing artist, but you know what I mean.
I could list off a bunch of authors. You know, I could start with James Baldwin. I mean, I could go through a whole bunch of others. I could talk about one author who I love right now. I don't particularly care for his stories. His 3rd novel I like, but I love his sentences. It's Armored Towels. Are you familiar with him? Wrote A Gentleman in Moscow. And his first 2 books, I don't like the books, but I love his sentences. So I'll read that, so that inspires me. So the way someone writes something, their sentences inspires me. But if I was to say, let me go back to what was my first inspiration, it was my grandmother's dining room table. You know, I grew up in a culture where you sat down at the table at 2 o'clock and you didn't leave it until 10 o'clock at night. And I heard those stories over and over again, over and over and over. But I think already I must have had a writer's ear, because I'd listen and I'd want to hear them over and over and over. And I see some of it in my work. I mean, a lot of in sanctuaries, you're going to read a lot about baking. In Most Precious Blood, you're going to read a lot about food, cooking. And it makes sense because that's where I learned. There was food, there was always food around. Do you know what I mean? So does that help? So it's kind of the marriage between someone who probably from the beginning had a writer's ear, because I'll share these stories with cousins and they'll say, well, where the hell was I? I don't remember any of that. And to be honest, I don't know, I might be making up this. But, you know, that's where it inspired. I love it. And also connected to what this topic is today with Catholicism. I love the stories. I loved the stories. But you know what? The practice didn't match the stories. It didn't match the stories. It was like, well, I'm hearing something you ain't hearing. Does that answer a little bit? I mean, later, if you're more interested in certain writers, we could talk later and I could say, you know, who some of my favorite authors are.
I have one. How does your experience of creating self-portraits differ from your experience of creating portraits of others? And then you also mentioned that you started with self-portraits. So I'm curious about, you know, how at all when you started taking portraits of others and like even working on the dry conservation, if that changed your process or the way that you see yourself and how you portray yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, actually, when I first started doing self-portraits, it was mostly because like I mentioned earlier, I'm an introvert and I didn't really like to ask even my friends if I could take their picture. So I just started using myself. And also, in a way, it was a lot of even therapy for myself because it's somebody that didn't feel like my existence mattered. Even in my 20s, I felt like creating images of myself and using myself as a subject sort of helped me in a way, I guess, I don't want to say like it helped my self-esteem, but in a way it did actually. You know, I use those images and me as a subject as a way for me to work through a lot of my things that I had been struggling for most of my life, whether it was my queerness or my big nose or my big forehead or, you know, all these other things that I struggled with. So then when I started taking pictures of other folks, that helped boost up my self-esteem, just in the fact that people were willing to do what I said or what I asked them to, or however I wanted them to position themselves. It was always, it was a nice transition, I guess, from me trying to, also, I wasn't a good communicator back then, or getting people to pose a certain way was very hard for me to get them to do that. And now, over the years, I've gotten more comfortable with me feeling confident enough to tell them, like, oh, turn this way, turn that way, chin up, chin down, arch your back, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, it definitely has shifted.
Anyone else?
So it sounds like your community has been growing as you've gone through and developed this body of work. So I'm curious, like, how do you know, or how have you been finding subjects? Is it just with friends or?
Actually, now it's been mostly through my social media, either through Instagram or Facebook. Not so much Facebook anymore, but mostly Instagram. Like if I know that I'm going to go to a city, I'll post on my IG like who are some of the folks that I need to photograph or who I need to contact. And it's usually like if multiple people say one person, then that's the person that I'll approach. And because it's a project that's been going on for over a decade now, a lot of folks are like, oh, I was waiting for you to slide into my DM. So it's been really great to see like the reception that this work has gotten from folks.
More follow-ups. I know you mentioned that the flag with you and it is going to be inclusive. So are you one of your own queer icons?
Yeah. I'm part of every series that I start on the series just because I like to experiment with how the body of the work is going to look like. So I always use myself first before I ask other things. Then it's my best friend, it's the second person, and then just trickles out.
I just was thinking about how your reading of how Hudson devoured the youth of that era because they were queer and they were not accepted in their families, which I got very emotional. How did that inspire you? I think I have a question. I think it's that, what led you to that aspect?
You're gonna have to be loud, Larry.
I'm saying, what led you to that aspect of writing about that, Gianni's experience? I don't know how I put it. The emotional character of that chapter that you read was so powerful.
Right, right. Well, I mean, one thing, we all have, well, if we're somewhat activists, we think things need to change, you know, we kind of have priorities of what we're most concerned about. I am most driven by the challenges that queer youth face even today, not just back then. That is my primary. I've been involved in a lot of politics, a lot of progressive politics on all kinds of levels. And even today, when I'm involved with something, I have to ask the question about, and how are we talking about queer youth, and how are they involved, and how are they part of what we're doing? And if I don't have an answer, I don't want to be part of it. I mean, that's where I am right now, to be honest. If we're talking about food, if we're talking about hunger, if we're talking about the environment, if we're talking about prisons, if we're talking about rape, if we're talking about anything, one of my questions is going to be, and how are we talking about queer youth? And how are they involved? And if people look at me like, huh? I'm 72 years old, I only got a couple of years left. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, this is, yeah,
I'm 72,
this,
right?
you gotta,
Hear you, Vince.
yeah, you gotta pick out, you know, what you have time for.
Yeah.
So that,
But I saw such an emotional.
right, that's a big driving force. And so, because it's still true today. You know, yes, I could say this took place in the late 60s, but you think it's not true today? Look at what's going on in Tennessee. Look at what's going on in Florida.
Exactly.
This is ridiculous. Imagine being a queer youth today, hearing that over and over and over again on social media, and then still having to go out the next day and deal with life. You've got to be, I don't know why. You have to have the strength of the world to do something like that. And unfortunately, and I'll put that right out there as a queer man, there are a lot of queer folks my age, or gay men my age, who wind up thinking, oh yeah, but they don't have it like we had it. It might be different. It may be that maybe the closet's been broken open somewhat, but it's still there and it's still hard. And we don't, and I get it, I understand it. We don't, as queer elders, sometimes do for our youth what we need to. I understand what part of that comes from, because right away we are accused of being pedophiles. So I understand where that comes from, but we still have to take those risks because they're our children.
Sure.
They're our children. Whether they're your biological child, whether they're your adopted child, whether it's a child that's in another country, the queer child who lives in Afghanistan is my child. And I want to know how he's doing. So thank you very, very much. Please, if you're interested, there are books here, and or if you want to peruse any of the other books. Actually, the first, not the first, but the way that I met Manny was that both of our works appeared in Queer and Catholic about, oh my God, I don't even have it, so 20 years, maybe longer. It was quite a while ago. And we did a reading of Blue Stockings, and that's how I first met Manny. And this was edited by Trevor Healy and Amy Evans. And I know a lot of Trevor's work is here also. So support indie bookstores, support queer authors, support us. We ain't gonna put up with the shit that's going on right now. We ain't going nowhere. We're here, we're queer, get used to it. I love you.